Thank you very much, and I will share my screen. Good evening or morning, depending on where you are and when you're watching this. We're here to talk about Takamine whiskey from our company, Honkaku Imports. I am Stephen Lyman. I'm the author of The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks, which was nominated for a James Beard Award. Also the co-host of the Japan Distilled podcast with my partner in crime, Christopher Pellegrini, who I'll introduce in a second. I was actually the first American to make shochu in Japan. And I do shochu education for the Sake School of America. And both Christopher and I are shochu and awamori ambassadors recognized by the Japanese Cabinet Office. Christopher, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Pellegrini at your service. Seriously, just ping either of us if you ever have questions about what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. I wrote a book, and I, along with Stephen, am the co-host of Japan Distilled, a podcast that's about all of the spirits from Japan, especially, well, and primarily the ones that you drink. I have a couple of nerd qualifications in the Shochu and Awamori sphere. I judge spirits internationally, and also, as Stephen mentioned, we help to promote this indigenous Japanese spirits category worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. So just to set context, shochu and awamori, Christopher came up with this top line phrase, which I really love, that it's an intensely artisanal Japanese craft refined over 6 centuries in the Japanese archipelago. And shochu has actually outsold sake in Japan since 2003, but it's almost unknown overseas. And then Okinawan awamori is actually a sister tradition that's even older. I might even call it like shochu's uncle, just because it's a little bit older. All of these products are made from seasonally produced, or all of these products are seasonally produced from local agriculture. And they're often handmade in small family-run distilleries throughout Japan. And there's a very strong terroir, actually, with 4 WTO geographic indications, all concentrated down in the blue portion of that map in Kyushu and Okinawa. And we'll get into that in other presentations. As far as what we're trying to do with Honkaku Imports, we're really focused on premium whiskey, craft shochu, and aged awamori. And our mission is really Koji spirits becoming a household word in America, that people understand what a Koji spirit is, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. And we really have a craft spirits portfolio of Japanese products tailored to Western tastes, a select line of Japanese whiskeys, which are made with the unique Takamine process, which is really the focus of today's talk, and then a line of premium craft shochu from Japan and awamori from Okinawa. We're currently partnered with 22 family-run distilleries, which were established between 1745 and 1947. So the Takamine story. I'd like to introduce you to Jokichi Takamine. He may be the most important Japanese person you've never heard of, at least outside of Japan. He was born into a sake-making family in the 1800s during the time when Japan was opening up to the West. And he was actually one of the first graduates from Tokyo University. In fact, he was part of the first graduating class of the engineering department with a degree in biochemistry, is how we would think about what he studied today. And in 1890, he moves to Chicago. And so actually, there's a reason he moves to Chicago, which I didn't put into this slide. He met and fell in love with an American woman when he was part of a Japanese government delegation to the World's Fair in New Orleans. They fell in love, got married, and actually moved back to Japan and had a couple of children. But at the urging of his wife's, actually at the urging of his mother-in-law, the family moves to Chicago. And in 1891, just 1 year after moving, he develops the Takamine process. And he goes on actually, and this is where he really ends up having a huge impact on the world. He isolates medical adrenaline in his laboratory in Harlem, in New York City. And this has saved millions of lives as a medical treatment around the world. So the reason he moved to Chicago was because his mother-in-law had a relationship with the Illinois Whiskey Trust, and she realized that because of his background as a biochemist and the fact that he came from a sake making family, I guess they had talked a lot about how that's made, and he adapted sake making techniques to whiskey making. And it actually, as this headline in the Chicago Tribune read, whiskey to become cheaper. And the reason for that is that the Takamine process is actually more efficient in malting barley than malt. And because of that efficiency, they could actually lower costs. And it was estimated they would save the Whiskey Trust millions of dollars in mass production of their whiskey. Now, 2 weeks after that article was published, there was a mysterious fire at the Manhattan Distillery in Peoria, Illinois, where they were running the experiments. How this fire started and who was responsible was never determined. But there are strong indications it may have been the maltsters who were afraid of losing their jobs to this new upstart Japanese chemist. And fortunately, the distillery was able to be rebuilt. And in 1894, the Takamine process starts at the Manhattan Distillery in Peoria, Illinois. 3 months later, the distillery goes out of business. And the Takamine whiskey is lost to history. All of the barrels were apparently sold off to other interests and blended into other products. And the Takamine whiskey was never released to the American public. Now, as I said, he isolated adrenaline. He became fantastically wealthy, and he actually donated the cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C., which we still enjoy every spring. So what is this mysterious Takamine process? Well, I did mention at the top of the talk, this is Koji. And Koji is actually the national mold of Japan. Japan takes its fermentation so seriously that it has a national mold. And this is used to make all sorts of foods and beverages in Japan. So soy sauce, miso, mirin, it's used for pickling, it's used to make sake. I mean, it's not too much to say that Japanese cuisine would not exist without Koji, as we understand Japanese cuisine. Now, Koji does a couple of interesting things. It can saccharify sugars, but it can also break down protein. So it's also used as a meat tenderizer. In fact, and then as a digestive aid. In fact, that's how Takamine made his first fortune as a biochemist, is through a digestive aid pill that you could take that was, actually, it might have been a powder or a liquid, I'm not sure, that they could, that people could take when they had when their stomach was upset. And it was actually Koji that was helping calm their stomach. So Koji is a pretty remarkable mold. And as I said, it's how sake is made. It's actually how shochu and awamori are also made, the other traditional Japanese spirits. And of course, in the late 1800s, Takamine was attempting to make whiskey with Koji. So, and as I mentioned, Koji is actually more efficient in malting barley than malting. Now, there is an extra step required. The barley needs to be polished. So unlike whiskey making, where you're using a cerealed grain in the whole grain in the malting process, you use polished barley for production, which actually gives you a cleaner distillate because you're removing the outer husks, the proteins, the fats, those sorts of things that are that might give you different flavors. So this brings us to Takamine Koji whiskey, which is brought to you by the Shinozaki Distillery in Fukuoka and our company in New York. This is the front of the Shinozaki Brewery and Distillery in Asakura, Fukuoka. Sometime in the 1800s, they're not exactly sure when, they began making sake. And you have to understand that in the early 1800s was before businesses were incorporated quite the way they are today, because that was the samurai era. This is when they had the shogun who was running things, was a closed economy. And so there were a lot of alcohol producers who weren't officially recognized as businesses. They officially incorporated in 1922, and then they began distilling spirits in 1979. and then they actually obtained their whiskey license in 2019. But because of the Takamine process, they could make this product prior to getting their whiskey license. The whiskey license only allows them to make malt whiskey. So that's a distinction in Japanese law. They also own a local lumber business, which we'll get to why that's important in a little bit. So this is actually Asakura Fukuoka. This is in the breadbasket of Fukuoka. Really nice river valley, nice plains for high quality rice and barley production. And then it actually has the climate of probably central Georgia, South Carolina. It's relatively hot and humid in the summer, mild winters, but you've got temperature fluctuation, which obviously matters for aging. Now, having their own lumber company means that they can source their own wood for custom barrels from the Ariake cooperage, which is the only independent cooperage in Japan, down in Miyazaki, which is about probably a 2.5-hour drive south from Asakura, where they're based. And then there on the right, you have a picture of one of their aging warehouses using kind of a modified rack system, I guess. And so how this all started actually is that I've been friends with Michiaki Shinozaki for around a decade. And we, in our many drinking sessions, we came up with the idea of creating a project together. And we decided to create a whiskey brand that reflects the unique traditions of Kyushu down here in southern Japan, actually where I'm based. And in researching whiskey traditions, we found the Takamine story. We discovered this in our research. And actually, I found this during the research for my book. And that's where I hit upon it. And then after quite a bit of conversations and some experimentation at the distillery, they ended up figuring out this Takamine process as best as they could replicate it. And they received permission actually from Takamine's family trust to revive the Takamine process and use his name for the branding, which is the first time they've allowed commercial use of his name since the family trust was established. And so this is the Takamine Koji whiskey, again, made using this Takamine process. It's 100% barley. It's double distilled and it's aged in virgin oak and ex-bourbon casks. And our release schedule, we have this 8-year expression, which is releasing imminently. And sometime over this year, we plan to bring in a sherry cask finish, a brandy cask finish. And then something I'm really excited about is this winter, a 15-year-old cinnamon barrel-aged whiskey. Now, this is not a cinnamon whiskey like a Fireball. This is naturally cinnamon flavored from using cinnamon wood for the cask. And it's a really, really interesting drink. And that is made using Shinozaki lumber. And then in the spring of next year, in honor of the cherry blossom trees that were donated to Washington, D.C., we're planning a release of a Japanese cherry cask finished Takamine, which is also made with Shinozaki lumber. And then in the future, we do hope to have longer age-stated expressions. And then, yep, so unfortunately, these products are limited. Maybe I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate. We sold in 6-packs and our suggested retail is right around $100. I think that's all I have.
We've got lots of time for questions though too, which is
Yes.
great. So I notice here, classically, when we see Japanese whiskey, we see it spelled without an E. And I feel like there's always debate about who uses an E and who doesn't use an E. But I know you are very distinct in why you put the E back in Japanese whiskey.
That's right. We did that specifically because this is, in our minds, a revival of an American tradition. Because this Takamine process was first used in Illinois in the 1800s. Now, to set context, that was 25 years before Masataka Taketsuru went to Scotland to learn how to make malt whiskey. So you had this Japanese chemist in America making whiskey 25 years before the founder of Nika whiskey actually learned how to make Scotch. So to us, it's just a very interesting, almost stillborn whiskey expression And the opportunity to bring it back and share it with people is really exciting.
Yeah, it's almost as if Takamine had made it back and started making whiskey in Japan first. He probably would have kept the American recognized spelling with the E in it, but because legend has it, you know, or reality probably has it, you've got it from Scotland instead.
Is anybody working on a screenplay for a TV show or a television series so we can get some of that free publicity?
It's a great idea.
That is awesome. Yep.
I was thinking that during the part when you talked about the maltsters destroying the warehouse, and I was thinking like this seems like a movie, you know, like it's Chicago and it's, you know, skullduggery based around the liquor business. Like that's got to sell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the biggest distilleries operating in the United States at that time, obviously pre-prohibition, were in Illinois. So you had huge volume distilleries that had so much money invested in all the equipment and the way that it aligned to allow for the processes that they were comfortable with. And I can't imagine that people would have been very comfortable with what they considered any foreigner coming in and improving on their process. So do you have an idea of how much more efficient this process is at saccharification?
That's a great question. Who was I talking to about this just the other day? It's remarkably more efficient. Christopher, do you remember the numbers? I think that came up.
All I remember off the top of my head is timeline in terms of start to finish, how long it takes to create the Koji. And Stephen, you have copious experience with that.
Sure.
We're talking less than 2 days.
Yeah, to get the Koji to propagate on steamed barley, it's a 2-day process. If you're using a traditional method, which actually I don't know if you can do it any faster, even with machinery. But basically, the entire grain is liquefied in the fermentation by the end. So you're extracting virtually all available sugars. Now the actual fermentation takes longer, but the alcohol yield is higher. So the Takamine fermentation actually finishes at 19% alcohol after, I believe it's about a little over 2 weeks of time in 2 separate fermentations. So something I didn't talk about earlier is actually you do a first fermentation, which is with Koji inoculated barley, water, and yeast. And that becomes essentially a yeast starter that you then add more barley, just steamed barley. It's not Koji inoculated, to the second fermentation, and the enzymes and the Koji that's active in that first fermentation break down that new barley. So you end up at about a 19% fermentation, which I understand whiskey ferments tend to be quite a bit lower than that for
Much
yeah,
lower.
well, I mean, whiskey, it's really, I always say all whiskey is just distilled beer. And so the quality
Right.
of your raw ingredients or the beer the outcome is going to be very different whiskey. And most of the time in American or Scotch distilling, the beer, the first kind of fermentation, you end somewhere between 7.5% and maybe 9% alcohol. So yeah, you hear efficiency numbers like 18. That is something a bourbon distillery or a Scotch distillery would go crazy for on the outside. If it didn't mean learning something totally new, bringing in a completely new process. If somebody just knew all things equal how to do that, you would think they would all jump ship and do that.
Yeah.
Because it's twice as efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and in the sake world, using the exact same process, of course, with rice and rice only to make sake, you're getting, they've capped legally in Japan the alcohol percentage of this is just a brewed beverage, can get up to 23% alcohol. It's just a remarkably efficient process, Koji, and it creates some of the highest mash alcohol levels in the world. I know that there are some pretty impressive beers out there, but I mean, this is a really, really, if you get it right, easily high teens on these fermentations.
So then what is how high will the second distillation get? Like what is the highest alcohol that you would then get from that distillation? And then what proof would you go into the barrel?
Well, that's an interesting thing because of the licensing that Shinozaki was working under. Until they received their whiskey license, they were prohibited from having a final distillate above 45% alcohol. In fact, it has to be below 45. So 44.9 essentially the maximum that they can age anything or keep anything in their warehouses, simply because they were working under Shochu distilling license. But this is not Shochu, because Shochu is single distilled. And then Shochu is cannot be barrel aged for as long as these products have been barrel aged. So what they do actually in doing the double distillation is they distill. It's coming off their distill is around 45% alcohol after the first run. And then what they do is they dilute that down to about 20% alcohol and they redistill it.
That's what I was going to ask. That's the logical is if you already have an 18% alcohol beer, you're probably going to come off at 45%. So that makes sense.
Yeah. So a lot of single distilled shochu will be stored at between usually 40 and 45% alcohol for rice and barley fermentations for shochu. For sweet potato, it tends to be lower. It's around between 35 and 38% alcohol for most sweet potato shochus, because the tails actually have a lot of the interesting character in a sweet potato distillate compared to rice and barley, where you want to make an earlier cut.
That makes sense. What are the stills like? You know, we think a lot of like these very romantic copper pot stills in Scotland, or we think of, you know, the mix of maybe a pot still or a hybrid still or a column still in American whiskey making. What are the stills like here?
The stills are actually usually stainless, and a lot of whiskey lovers cringe at the idea because the natural expectation is that if you're not using a copper still, you're going to get sulfur, right? But because the barley is polished, and perhaps some effect of koji, we're not really sure. In fact, we've extensively searched the literature on this, and we haven't been able to figure out exactly why, but there is no sulfur in this distillate, despite the fact that it's made with a stainless steel still. But it is a stainless steel pot still.
Yep, that's awesome. We gotta add pictures. I know we talked about that last time. Let's add a slide with pictures of the stills when you get them.
Yeah. Well, we real quick. Yeah. Sorry to we were talking about the ABV of the final distillate. Now, this is something to me as a, you know, coming at this more from the American perspective, as, you know, a bourbon guy, seeing 80 proof a lot of the time kind of turns me away from a whiskey. But what's really interesting with Takamine is, of course, because of the Koji fermentation, because of the Takamine process, you end up with a really rich mouthfeel in spite of the low ABV. And also, it's important to remember that you're working with something that, of course, coming off the still around 45% roughly, and it's going into the barrel around 45%. So there is minimal dilution by the time it reaches the bottle. So it's pretty damn close to cask strength.
I was going to say too, Jake, it's an excellent point, because also the trend that most of our team will note that's happening a lot in the bourbon world as people learn more and more about it, but we're actually seeing it extending into Scotch and other spirits, is that the higher, whatever alcohol percentage you go into the barrel, you're going to get different things out of the barrel. And we're seeing more and more, especially American distillers, that have discovered that the lower proof you put in it, the less harsh notes you pull out of the barrel. So we're seeing them go from that classic, you know, that was 67, 62. Now they're going down to 53, 50. We're even hearing 45, 46. And mostly we're hearing about this across the board with very positive results, which then always, again, lends the question, then why wouldn't everybody just go into the barrel at 45% alcohol?
More expensive.
Because it's more expensive because you're aging water.
Yeah.
Got it.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's another piece of the Takamine heritage. At the time that Takamine was distilling in the United States, low barreling proofs around the 80, 90 proof range were pretty common. Maybe not necessarily standard, but it was not unusual. And like you mentioned, we haven't seen anything like that pretty much anywhere in the world in whiskey until the past couple of years, with some really interesting craft distilleries trying to revive this old style. So you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that our product is probably some of the longest matured of all of the whiskeys made in the world right now, being barreled at such low ABV.
nothing to correct there. I think you're probably completely spot on. So what will be the difference? Like, we're obviously really excited to see this one land and to get, nice.
That's actually the still. Unfortunately, it's tucked in a corner.
It's really hard to photograph that one. Yeah.
Yep.
There's no way you can, and there's stuff everywhere. So every time you try to back up, you slam into more metal.
Yeah. So
it looks like a really beautiful robot.
we will have nice still photos from other distilleries where it's a little bit more front and center in the floor and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, the Shinozaki still is tucked here because they actually make in the same complex of buildings. And you saw the front of the distillery is that old Japanese building, and then they built up around it over time. And they make the Takamine whiskey. They make something called amazake, which is a sweet rice beverage, but it's non-alcoholic. And that's actually their main product. That's what keeps the lights on for them. And then they also make sake and they make shochu. And they're doing all of these productions in adjacent rooms around the, this complex. And so the still sort of it fits where it can.
Yeah,
a really interesting element. One of my favorite elements within this distillery is they actually have a tree growing.
You stole my point.
Sorry, Christopher.
I love that part of the distillery. There are trees growing in it.
There's a tree growing up through the roof of the building, and they've customized the cement floor around it. And in Japan, if a tree is considered sacred, they actually will hang, I believe it's Shinto, almost garlands around the trees. And it has a Shinto garland around it, and a priest comes and prays for the health of the tree every year. And the tree grows up through the top of the building.
I think there's actually two of them, aren't there?
Like active live yeast coming from that too.
Yeah,
you've got lots of people that really love the flora and fauna near a distillery for exactly that reason. But it's rare that
distillery.
In whiskey, I can't think of another whiskey distillery anywhere in the world that I know of that has a tree or trees growing in it.
Yeah,
we're gonna need pics of that too, especially because houseplants are hot right now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Since what's so hot? Sorry.
Houseplants. So having a distillery tree, I think it'll be just some good eye candy. Need a picture.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Christopher got some pictures of that.
I would love to hear like a little bit more, because I think it's so interesting, and what an amazing homage back to this family of like, there's no overstating how important Takamine was as a doctor, isolating medical adrenaline, like the cherry blossoms, all these really interesting kind of Americans, connections back, but also the fact that you two had to have, the foresight, the planning, the conversation to go back to the family. And, like, what was that? I don't know. What was that conversation like?
Well, it was, it was really unfortunate because I couldn't go on that trip because of other commitments. There was like the family has a reunion. They actually live up in, I believe, Ishikawa Prefecture. And they have a reunion every year. And at the reunion is when this family trust meets to make decisions. And so Michiaki flew up and spent, I think, the weekend with them and was able to talk to them about how much he had been inspired by the Takamine story and how he was, really happy to have been able to revive this. It was a lot of trying to gain that personal connection with the family. And they really embraced it wholeheartedly.
Did they also know that you had found out about it from researching your book and knew that it was going to get mentioned in a book? And, it's so interesting really being outsiders. I know that you guys live there, and, so that's very different than just kind of coming in and seeing an opportunity for, profit or whiskey or whatever and running away with it. Like, you really were digging deep. So I have, have to hope that they were very honored by that too.
That I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how that how that communication was done. What information was shared with the family at that time. But the other thing, in order to pay tribute, is the artwork on the label. That's in Japanese. That's called shodo. So it's a style of art. It's the very classic calligraphy from Japan, and Shinozaki wanted to have artwork that he felt reflected both the product and this tradition, and worked with a quite famous shodo artist to create that artwork. That's not just something that a graphic designer threw together. That's a piece of art that could hang in a museum somewhere. So we're really happy to have that, the Shoto artwork. And I think the fact that he had gone through the trouble of wanting to work with this artist also convinced the family that the product was in good hands. Now he didn't obviously have the artwork made until he had permission to use the name, but because that says Takamine in Japanese.
Do they get like 1 case a year of their namesake whiskey to drink?
I'd hope they get at least a case, but I don't know I don't know if there are any bribes involved.
No. It's better than a royalty, because if we're all successful at selling thousands of cases of it, a case of whiskey a year is going to be an easy price to pay.
That's true. Yeah.
I was wondering if it might be useful to describe what it tastes like. As I was listening to the presentation this time, I was thinking, what impact on the flavor does the Takamine process have? And not necessarily in terms of traditional tasting notes like metaphors for other flavors and aromas, but what does it taste like in the context of the whiskey world? For example, the way that Chris Udy describes the rice-based whiskey as having characteristics similar to 1970s bourbon because of the oxidation, the additional oxidation that had and the lower barrel entry proof. So how would you describe the unique taste of the Takamine process in terms of whiskey, in the whiskey context?
So Dan, before these guys give you like the real answer, I will tell you that for 8 months, almost a year, I was hearing about this, and I made this deal with never tasting anything. I've never done anything like this. I mean, who would do that? I'm an idiot. But then I meet these 2 young men, Stephen and Christopher, and we bring in Jake. And I look forward right now, because when Jake and I together did this tasting with Stephen and Christopher, I guess, Jake, you were what, 6 months in before we tasted it? I was a year in before tasting it. This is the highlight of my day right now, to hear what they're going to tell you. But the real highlight is going to be when we can finally get you guys a chance to taste it. I'm done.
Sorry for the wait.
I would have made that deal too with these people, and from what I've heard so far.
Thank you, Dan.
I think you
Appreciate that.
Made a good decision. But I'm still curious, because I think it's going to be helpful to give our salespeople some language to talk to whiskey buyers and whiskey enthusiasts about, like, how is this different from other Japanese whiskey, or how is it similar to single malt?
Right.
Yeah, I think I actually let Jake start this out, and then I may have some things to add afterward.
So you asked something really interesting, which was specifically about the Takamine process and how that affects the whiskey. And like I mentioned earlier, for me, the way it really comes across is in the mouthfeel of the product. And also, and I kind of go back and forth on the idea of umami as a separate taste versus just a combination of savory and a little bit of sweetness. Stephen and Christopher, I hope you don't think that's blasphemy, but it really does have this kind of umami to it that you don't get in any other whiskey that I've tried. And I credit that 100% to the Koji fermentation. Now, what really distinguishes the product beyond that umami note and the great mouthfeel is the use of virgin oak. And Stephen, you could correct me, but it was roughly 90% virgin oak to 10% ex-bourbon cask breakdown. It drinks, and it sounds crazy. To me, it does not drink like a single malt. It doesn't drink like any other Japanese whiskey I've had. It drinks like a refined, nuanced bourbon. You get that sweetness of and that's something else that's got to be the Koji fermentation, is the way the sweetness of the barley comes across. It's different than a malted barley, and to me, in some ways, is a little bit more similar to the sweetness of corn without that. You know how sometimes in a young bourbon you'll get that corn taste? It's all of the sweetness of corn with none of the corn. So, I mean, to me, it really drinks shockingly similar to a bourbon. And I'd mentioned this in an earlier call. I had a friend of mine taste a sample blind. And this is a guy who I've done at this point probably close to a dozen barrel picks of all different bourbons with. He's a judge at the American Spirits, or the American Whiskey Convention. And I mean, I trust this guy's palate as much as I trust my own. And blind, when I had him taste it, an 80 proof, 8-year age stated Japanese whiskey, he said roughly 15-year-old bourbon pushing 110 proof. And he was blown away by it. And he was even more blown away when I told him what the hell the stuff actually was.
I bet.
He's begging me to get him as much as I possibly can. So, Stephen and Christopher, is there anything you guys want to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, Jake picked up on a couple of key points, and I think the sweetness and the umami that he described are both coming from the Koji fermentation process, because you've essentially sacrificed virtually the entire grain of barley, right? You've turned all that starch into sugar. So that's going to give you that sweetness. But then the Koji itself, in the Koji process, it imparts umami. Miso is nothing but umami and salt. Soy sauce is umami and salt, right? Anything made with Koji ends up having umami as part of the expression. And that's, I think the other thing that does to it, because umami is really hard for us to describe to American consumers, right? We know that it's a Japanese taste. We know that it's sort of savory, but what is it, right? It's sort of like it when you see it, sort of thing. And it's, for me, umami gives the spirit a depth that a spirit without an umami component feels more thin. There's something missing, right? Sometimes when I go to American whiskeys or Scotch whiskeys, or even Japanese malt whiskeys, there's almost something missing for me after having, gotten used to drinking these Koji ferments. So yeah. It's a really interesting added layer that I think hopefully consumers will really respond to.
It's a whole
Maybe it's a fast track to some of the complexity that we get from the oxidation that comes from longer term aging, which is why we get that 15-year age statement, or Chris's metaphor of the rice-based, but Koji using whiskeys tasting like 1970s bourbon. I usually try and describe umami to people in terms of referencing the other things that they're familiar with that have a lot of it, that are part of the Western diet, like concentrated tomatoes, like tomato paste and ketchup, or beef broth, things like that. Because those are things, or else I'll just say, like, those things that taste extra good, that's umami.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the striking one for me in Western food is Parmesan cheese.
Yeah,
it's just so good.
Savory, saline, mouth-watering.
I'll use Chex Mix as well, because that always gets Worcestershire sauce. That's
that's interesting.
With the
Worcestershire
Chex
sauce,
I like that.
MSG, which is pure umami.
Right.
and there's some MSG haters out there, but
oh, certainly.
Well,
that was Jake. That's great. One way that I when I was training my palate to recognize umami in drinks, I was using MSG water. I would put a glass of water, pour MSG in it, taste it, just to keep on, and I would do that a couple times a week just to remind myself that's what you're looking for.
It's monosodium glutamate. Don't do drugs.
It's flavor plus.
It's flavor plus. So do you all know of any other producers using this process right now? And what are your thoughts on, as people kind of learn about it, get to actually taste it, get to experience it? Can other people use this process, but they don't have to call it the Takamine process? Like, what is the very distinct competitive set look like right now? And what's the potential of it going forward?
Great question.
That's a really, really good question. The Takamine process was patented in the United States in the 1800s. You can imagine that patent has lapsed. So anyone can make this now if they figure out how to propagate Koji effectively on barley. Currently in the market in the US, I'm only aware of one other Japanese whiskey that could be called the Takamine process. And it's from Shinozaki's chief rival. Wait, is this going to be completely public, or is this just going to be
just leave them
to...
unnamed. You can tell us later.
Okay.
And I don't think they understand what they have, and I actually don't, and I don't think it's double distilled.
And no one else can use the Takamine name because you had to get express permission to use that.
That's correct.
Yep.
Did you have any trouble getting through the TTB with labeling what you could actually put on the label?
Yep. So actually, the label that you saw in the presentation, I realized you're seeing the old label that says Takamine Koji whiskey. The revised label, actually, which is what you'll see on the bottles, and I do have a mock-up, and I apologize for not putting it in the talk. They did not let us call it Koji whiskey because Koji whiskey is not a recognized category of whiskey
yet.
Good timing, Christopher. So what the label actually says is Koji fermented Takamine whiskey. That's what we settled on with the TTB, and they
weren't allowing us to be as transparent as we are trying to be. We want to call it Koji whiskey. They wouldn't let us. So,
we'll call it Koji whiskey in the market. I can't wait till we get to taste it and just call it delicious.
Yeah. Well, the website calls it Koji whiskey, so which we're allowed to do. We just can't put it on the actual label of the.
Is the website up and live now?
The website is, I believe, I need to check my email. I think it's been finalized, and they're just waiting for us to say go. The holdup was actually sort of this animation to make it fun and modern and cool. And we said, look, scrape all that. Let's get a landing page with all the relevant information, and you can make it pretty later. So we will have the website up imminently. I'm hoping by tomorrow.
Today or tomorrow?
Probably today. So when you guys wake up tomorrow, hopefully there's an email with a link to the website.
There'll be a website. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you and the folks on our team that could join us tonight. So we've got this recorded out there. We'll be sharing it with the Winebow team. And obviously it's just great to be able to do something a little bit more in depth. And I really think this is just going to be part one of many, while we go down the rabbit hole of all of these Koji spirits and Shochu and Awamori, but also the other expressions of whiskey. So we've got lots more opportunities to move on with this. And as a reminder too, you've got the Japan Distilled podcast, which actually Daniel that's on right now, Daniel actually discovered that before you guys even told us. Daniel told the whole group that it was out there. But it's really, really fantastic. And I think as we are coming out of this pandemic and we're in our cars, we're on public transportation more and more, that's a great opportunity to go learn. Can you remind me what the website will be?
For Takamine, it will be honkakuspirits.com.
Honkaku Spirits, HONKAKU spirits.com.
Yep. And then that's, so we're Honkaku Imports as a company, but we'll be Honkaku Spirits consumer facing. And then it'll be /Takamine, I believe. But we'll send you that link. And then actually the first whiskey episode for our podcast drops on Monday, and that includes the Takamine story.
That'll be Monday, February 15th, 2021.
That's correct.
That's right.
The day after Valentine's Day.